The morning mist hung heavy over the settlement of Willow Creek, where Martha Thompson stood at her kitchen window, watching the other women gather water from the well. At 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered, she towered over most men in town, her calloused hands testament to years of hard labor that no suitor ever seemed to appreciate. The whispers followed her everywhere she went. The giant woman, they called her, built like an ox, but twice as stubborn. At 32, Martha had long accepted that marriage wasn't in her cards, not in a place where delicate flowers were prized over sturdy oaks. Before we continue with Martha's incredible journey, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and we love connecting with viewers from all corners of the globe. The settlement buzzed with tension that particular autumn morning. Apache raids had increased along the Colorado River, and the men spoke in hushed tones about missing cattle and burned homesteads. Martha's father, Samuel Thompson, had built their ranch on the outskirts of town, believing the isolation would bring prosperity. Instead, it brought loneliness for his daughter, who spent her days mending fences and herding cattle, while other women her age tended to children and husbands. Martha's childhood had been marked by the constant reminder that she was different. While other girls played with dolls and learned to embroider, she was helping her father brand cattle and repair broken wagon wheels. Her mother had died when Martha was 12, leaving behind only faded photographs and the whispered regret that she hadn't lived to see her daughter properly settled. Samuel had tried his best, but he was a rancher, not a mother, and he understood horses better than he understood the complexities of raising a daughter in a world that had very specific expectations for women. The local schoolmarm, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, had been the only person to encourage Martha's unconventional strengths. "You have the mind of a scholar and the heart of a pioneer," she had told Martha during her brief years of formal education. "Don't let this small town convince you that being extraordinary is a flaw." But Miss Hartwell had moved east to marry a banker, leaving Martha without an advocate in a community that saw her size and independence as character defects rather than assets. The men of Willow Creek had made their feelings clear over the years. Thomas Brennan, the blacksmith's son, had courted her briefly when she was 22, but his mother had put an end to it quickly. "What will people think?" she had demanded. "A woman who can lift more than her husband. It's unnatural." Even the traveling merchants and drifters who passed through town seemed intimidated by Martha's presence, as if her very existence challenged their understanding of how the world should work. "Martha, you're scaring off the suitors again," her father would joke, though his eyes held genuine concern. "Maybe if you wore a dress more often, acted a little more feminine." But Martha knew the truth. Her size intimidated men who expected wives they could protect, not women who could outwork them in the fields. She had learned to find solace in solitude, in the rhythm of hard work, and in the vast expanse of the frontier that seemed to understand her better than any person ever had. The ranch itself was a testament to Martha's capabilities. While other women tended gardens, she managed 200 head of cattle across 3,000 acres of rugged terrain. She could rope a steer, shoe a horse, and repair a fence with the skill of any cowhand. The neighboring ranchers grudgingly respected her abilities, even as their wives whispered about her unwomanly behavior. Martha had single-handedly saved the ranch during the drought of 1871. Driving the cattle to water sources she had scouted herself. While other ranchers lost half their herds, the river that bordered their property had always been both blessing and curse. During spring floods, it provided rich soil for their crops, but when autumn storms came, it turned treacherous, claiming livestock and sometimes lives. Martha had developed a healthy respect for its power, having pulled more than one calf from its muddy banks. The Arapaho who had lived in the region before the settlers called it angry water, and Martha understood why. The river seemed to have moods, sometimes gentle and welcoming, other times violent and unforgiving, Local legend spoke of the river's supernatural properties. Old-timers claimed it was cursed by the spirits of warriors who had died in its waters during ancient tribal conflicts. Martha didn't believe in such superstitions, but she had noticed that animals grew nervous near the water during certain weather patterns, and even the most experienced rivermen treated it with unusual caution. She had seen grown men refuse to cross it during storm season, preferring to ride 20 miles out of their way rather than risk the treacherous currents. That fateful afternoon, storm clouds gathered with unusual speed, turning the sky the color of old pewter. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity, and Martha's horses grew restless in their paddock, sensing the approaching tempest. She was checking the fence line near the river when the first drops of rain began to fall, each one as large as a silver dollar and surprisingly warm against her skin. The wind picked up suddenly, bending the cottonwood trees along the riverbank until their branches nearly touched the ground. Martha had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the signs of a flash flood. The river, which had been running low due to the dry autumn, could rise 10 feet in a matter of minutes when the mountain storms sent their runoff cascading down the canyon. She was preparing to head back to the ranch house when she heard it, a desperate cry cutting through the wind, a sound of pure terror that made her blood run cold. Her heart stopped as she saw a figure struggling in the churning waters, arms flailing against the current that threatened to drag him under. The river had already risen several feet, transforming from a lazy stream into a raging torrent of brown water filled with debris from upstream. Logs and branches tumbled past like battering rams, any one of which could kill a man with a single blow. The figure in the water was clearly losing the battle, his movements becoming weaker with each passing second. Without hesitation, without thought for her own safety, Martha kicked off her boots and plunged into the icy water. The shock of the cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her muscles seize momentarily. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, pulling at her heavy skirts and threatening to drag her down with the drowning man. But Martha had spent years building strength that most men envied, and she fought against the river with determination born of desperation. The figure in the water was a young Native American man, his long black hair streaming behind him as he struggled to stay afloat. Blood seeped from a wound on his head, likely from striking rocks in his fall, and his movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated. Martha could see that he was a warrior, his muscular frame and the quality of his clothing marking him as someone of importance among his people. His buckskin shirt was decorated with intricate beadwork, and silver ornaments caught the dim light filtering through the storm clouds. With powerful strokes, Martha reached him just as his strength began to fail. She wrapped one arm around his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his buckskin shirt, and began the arduous journey back to shore. The man was unconscious now, his full weight dragging them both toward the riverbed. Martha's lungs burned as she fought against the current, her legs pumping with the force of a steam engine. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she refused to let the river claim another victim. The journey back to shore felt like an eternity. Twice, floating logs nearly struck them, and Martha had to use her body to shield the unconscious warrior from the debris. Her waterlogged skirts wrapped around her legs like chains, threatening to pull her under, but she kicked them free and continued swimming with grim determination. The riverbank seemed impossibly far away, and Martha began to wonder if she had overestimated her own abilities. Just when her strength was beginning to fail, her feet touched bottom. The water was still chest-deep, and the current remained treacherous, but Martha was able to gain purchase on the rocky riverbed and begin the final push to safety. Step by agonizing step, she dragged herself and the unconscious warrior through the shallows, fighting against the current that seemed determined to reclaim its prize. When she finally dragged them both onto the muddy bank, Martha collapsed beside the unconscious warrior, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Rain began to fall in earnest, washing the blood from the man's forehead and revealing a face of striking nobility. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and skin the color of burnished copper spoke of proud heritage. Martha had never seen him before, but something about his bearing, even unconscious, suggested he was someone of importance among his people. The warrior's clothing was of the finest quality Martha had ever seen. His buckskin shirt was soft as silk and decorated with beadwork so intricate it must have taken months to complete. His leggings were similarly adorned, and his moccasins were works of art in themselves. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise, and his hair was bound with silver ornaments that spoke of wealth and status. This was no ordinary brave, but someone of great importance in his tribe. Martha knew she had to get him to shelter quickly. The storm was intensifying, and the warrior's body temperature was dropping dangerously. She managed to lift him, no small feat given his size and her own exhaustion, and began the difficult journey back to her cabin. The wind howled around them, driving the rain horizontally and making every step treacherous. Lightning split the sky with increasing frequency, and Martha could hear trees crashing in the distance as the storm reached its full fury. The cabin had never looked so welcoming as it did when Martha finally stumbled through the door, the unconscious warrior in her arms. She laid him on her father's bed and immediately began working to save his life. The gash on his head was deep and still bleeding, requiring immediate attention. Martha had learned basic medicine from necessity on the frontier, having treated everything from snake bites to broken bones over the years. She cleaned the wound carefully, noting that it would require stitches to heal properly. Her hands were steady as she threaded the needle, despite her exhaustion and the adrenaline still coursing through her system. The warrior stirred slightly as she began to stitch, but remained unconscious throughout the procedure. Martha worked by lamplight, the storm raging outside and making the cabin creak and groan with each gust of wind. As she worked, Martha had time to study her patient more closely. He was younger than she had first thought, probably in his mid-20s, with the lean, muscular build of a warrior in his prime. His hands were calloused from weapons training, but his fingernails were clean and well-maintained, suggesting someone accustomed to a certain level of comfort. The silver armband on his upper arm was engraved with symbols Martha didn't recognize, but their craftsmanship spoke of great skill and significant value. The warrior's breathing was steady, but shallow, and Martha worried about possible internal injuries from his ordeal in the river. She checked his ribs carefully, finding no obvious breaks, and his pulse was strong, despite his unconscious state. The head wound appeared to be his most serious injury, though she knew that appearances could be deceiving. She had seen men die from injuries that looked minor, and others survive wounds that should have been fatal. Throughout the long night, Martha kept vigil beside the warrior's bed. She changed his bandages regularly, monitored his breathing, and tried to keep him warm as the storm raged outside. The cabin's single room felt smaller with the presence of this stranger, this enemy of her people, who was now completely dependent on her care. She found herself studying his face in the lamplight, noting the strength in his features and wondering what circumstances had brought him to her river on this particular night. When he finally stirred to consciousness near midnight, his dark eyes met hers with a mixture of confusion and gratitude that needed no translation. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of the situation settling between them like a physical presence. Here was a white woman who had risked her life to save an Apache warrior, and here was that warrior, alive because of her courage and skill. The warrior tried to sit up, but Martha gently pressed him back down. "Easy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been hurt. You need to rest." He didn't understand her words, but her tone was universal, and he relaxed back onto the pillow. His eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that made Martha self-conscious about her appearance. Her hair was still damp from the river, and her clothes were wrinkled and stained from the rescue. The warrior spoke little English, but he managed to convey his name, Ayana, which Martha later learned meant eternal blossom in his language. The name seemed incongruous for such an obviously masculine warrior, but Martha sensed there was significance to it that she didn't understand. Through gestures and broken words, he told her of the flash flood that had swept him from his horse while he was scouting near the river. He had struck his head on a rock and would surely have drowned if not for her intervention. Ayana's presence in the area was itself significant. Apache warriors didn't scout alone unless they were on missions of great importance, and his fine clothing and obvious status suggested he was no ordinary brave. Martha began to suspect that she had saved someone very important indeed, though she had no way of knowing just how important until later events would reveal the truth. As the night wore on, Ayana's strength gradually returned. He was able to sit up and take some water, though he refused the food Martha offered. She understood that accepting food from an enemy might have cultural implications she couldn't comprehend. Instead, he seemed content to study her, his dark eyes taking in every detail of her appearance and manner. Martha found his scrutiny both uncomfortable and oddly flattering. It had been years since any man had looked at her with such focused attention. When dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ayana insisted on leaving, despite Martha's protests that he needed more rest. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling in the morning light. The river had returned to its normal level, though debris along its banks testified to the violence of the previous night's flood. Ayana stood slowly, testing his balance, and Martha could see that he was still weak from his ordeal. Before leaving, Ayana approached Martha with obvious solemnity. He clasped her hand in both of his, speaking words in his native tongue that she didn't understand, but felt in her heart were profound thanks. His hands were warm and strong, and Martha felt a strange connection to this man who had been her enemy just hours before. There was something in his eyes, a depth of gratitude and respect that she had never seen in the eyes of any white man. Ayana reached into his shirt and withdrew a small silver medallion, pressing it into Martha's palm. The metal was warm from his body heat, and the intricate engravings caught the morning light. Martha tried to refuse the gift, but Ayana insisted, speaking earnestly in his own language and gesturing between the medallion and his heart. She understood that this was more than a simple thank you gift. It was something of great personal significance to him. Martha watched him disappear into the morning mist, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator despite his recent injuries. She stood in her doorway long after he had vanished, the silver medallion warm in her palm and a strange sense of loss settling over her. She told no one in town about the rescue, knowing it would only bring trouble. Relations between the settlers and the Apache were strained enough without word spreading that she had aided one of their warriors. The medallion became Martha's secret treasure. She wore it on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothing, and found herself touching it during difficult moments. It seemed to carry some of Ayana's strength with it, reminding her that she was capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The rescue had awakened something in Martha, a sense of purpose and capability that had been dormant for too long. 3 days passed in relative normalcy, though Martha found herself scanning the horizon more frequently than usual. She worked her father's land, mended fences, and endured the usual stares and whispers from the townspeople, but her mind kept returning to those dark eyes and the gratitude she had seen in them. She had saved a life, perhaps prevented a war, and no one would ever know. The secret felt both burdensome and precious. On the 4th morning, Martha was awakened by a sound that made her blood run cold, the rhythmic beating of war drums echoing across the valley. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, primal rhythm that seemed to make the very earth vibrate. Her father burst into her room, his face pale with fear and his hands shaking as he reached for his rifle. "Apache war party," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Coming this way. We need to get to town, to the fort." But as Martha peered through her window, she saw something that defied explanation. The approaching party carried no weapons raised in anger. Instead, they rode in ceremonial formation, their horses adorned with colorful blankets and silver ornaments that caught the morning light like captured stars. The riders themselves were dressed in their finest regalia, feathers and beadwork, creating a display of wealth and status that took Martha's breath away. At their head rode Ayana, no longer the wounded man she had pulled from the river, but a proud chief in full regalia. Eagle feathers adorned his hair, creating a magnificent headdress that spoke of great deeds and high honor. His chest bore the elaborate breastplate of a leader, silver and turquoise worked into patterns that told the story of his lineage and achievements. Behind him, other warriors led pack horses laden with goods, furs, silver, beaded jewelry, and fine horses that spoke of great wealth. The transformation was so complete that Martha almost didn't recognize him. The injured warrior she had nursed had become a figure of such commanding presence that even her father, despite his fear, couldn't help but stare in awe. This was clearly a man of enormous importance among his people, and Martha began to understand the true significance of her rescue. She had not simply saved a warrior, she had saved a chief, a leader whose death might have meant war for the entire region. The drums grew louder as the procession approached Martha's cabin, their rhythm hypnotic and strangely beautiful. The sound seemed to awaken something primal in Martha's chest, a response to music older than civilization itself. Her father reached for his rifle, but Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Wait," she said, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't think they mean us harm." Something in Ayana's bearing, in the way he sat his horse with regal dignity, told her this was no raid. This was something else entirely, something that defied everything she thought she knew about the relationship between their peoples. The very air seemed charged with significance, as if the morning itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The war party stopped 50 yards from the cabin, forming a perfect semicircle that spoke of military precision and ceremonial importance. The horses stood motionless, their riders silent except for the continued beating of the drums. Martha could see that each warrior was armed, but their weapons remained sheathed and their posture spoke of respect rather than threat. This was clearly a formal delegation, not a war party. Ayana dismounted with fluid grace, his movements those of a born leader accustomed to command. In his hands, he carried a magnificent blanket, woven with intricate patterns in red, blue, and gold. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each thread placed with precision to create designs that seemed to tell stories of their own. When he reached the porch where Martha stood, he spread the blanket at her feet with ceremonial solemnity and began to speak in his native tongue. His voice carried across the morning air with the authority of a born leader, each word carefully chosen and delivered with obvious importance. Though Martha couldn't understand the language, she could hear the respect and formality in his tone. This was clearly a speech of great significance, delivered with all the gravity of a state occasion. The other warriors listened in respectful silence, their faces grave and attentive. An elderly warrior stepped forward to translate, his English heavily accented but clear. His weathered face spoke of many battles and much wisdom, and the deference shown to him by the other warriors marked him as a man of great respect within the tribe. "Chief Ayana, son of the great war leader Cochise, speaks to the woman who saved his life," he began, his voice carrying the weight of formal ceremony. Martha felt the world tilt beneath her feet at the mention of Cochise. Every settler in the territory knew that name, the legendary Apache leader whose very mention could strike fear into the hearts of the bravest men. If Ayana was truly Cochise's son, then she had saved not just any warrior, but Apache royalty. The implications of this revelation sent her mind reeling. The translator continued, his words measured and formal. He says, the spirits guided her hands that day, that her courage and strength mark her as worthy of the highest honor his people can bestow. The river spirit spoke to him in his dreams, telling him that the woman who saved him was chosen by the gods themselves to be his companion. He offers the bride price, 50 horses, silver worth a chief's ransom, and furs enough to keep a family warm for many winters. The magnitude of what was being offered struck Martha like a physical blow. 50 horses alone represented wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. In a territory where a good horse might cost a man's entire savings, such a herd was worth a fortune. The silver and furs would add even more value to an offer that was already beyond comprehension. He asks that she become his wife, the translator concluded, to unite their peoples in peace and honor. He says that a woman brave enough to risk her life for an enemy is a woman worthy to stand beside a chief. He will have no other wife, for the spirits have shown him that she is his destiny. Martha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The woman who had been rejected by every man in her own community was being courted by an Apache chief with riches beyond imagination. She looked at Ayana, seeing in his eyes not pity or obligation, but genuine admiration and respect. He had not come because he owed her a debt, but because he recognized in her the qualities his people valued most: courage, strength, and loyalty. The translator continued, his voice growing more passionate as he conveyed Ayana's words. Chief Ayana says he has watched the white settlements, seen how they treat their women like fragile birds in cages. He says a chief needs a wife who can stand beside him in battle, who can lead when he cannot, who can bear children strong enough to survive in a harsh world. He says the spirits showed him such a woman when she pulled him from the angry waters, and he will have no other. The words hit Martha with the force of revelation. Here was a man who valued the very qualities that had made her an outcast in her own community. Her strength, her independence, her courage, all the things that white men found threatening or unwomanly were exactly what this Apache chief was seeking in a wife. For the first time in her life, Martha felt truly seen and appreciated for who she was, rather than criticized for who she wasn't. Behind Ayana, his warriors began to chant, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to make the very earth vibrate. The music was unlike anything Martha had ever heard. Primal and beautiful, speaking to something deep in her soul that had been sleeping for too long. They were not threatening sounds, but songs of celebration and honor, welcoming her into their circle with voices that had been raised in war, but now sang of peace. Martha realized that this was not just a proposal of marriage, but a ceremony of alliance, a bridge between two worlds that had known only conflict. Her answer would affect not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in the settlement. If she accepted, it could mean peace between the Apache and the settlers. If she refused, it might mean the return of the warfare that had plagued the region for years. The assembled warriors continued their chanting, the sound growing more complex and beautiful as more voices joined the harmony. Martha could see that this was a moment of great significance for them as well. They were not just witnessing a marriage proposal, but potentially the birth of a new era of peace between their peoples. The weight of that responsibility settled on Martha's shoulders like a mantle. Martha's father stepped beside her, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "Martha, you can't seriously be considering this madness," he whispered urgently. "These are savages, heathens. What would people say? What would become of our family's reputation?" His voice carried the prejudices of a lifetime, the ingrained beliefs that had shaped his understanding of the world. But even as he spoke, Martha could see the doubt in his eyes. The wealth displayed before them was staggering, more than their ranch would earn in a lifetime. And there was something in Ayana's bearing that commanded respect, even from those who considered him an enemy. This was clearly no savage, but a leader of great intelligence and dignity, a man who commanded the loyalty of warriors and the respect of his people. "Look at them, father," Martha said quietly, gesturing to the assembled warriors. "Do they look like savages to you? Look at their discipline, their organization, the respect they show their leader. This is a civilization as complex and sophisticated as our own, just different." She could see her father struggling with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught to believe. The morning sun climbed higher as Martha wrestled with the most important decision of her life. Around her, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. The chanting continued, beautiful and hypnotic, while Ayana stood motionless before her, his dark eyes holding promises of a life she had never dared to imagine. For Martha, the choice was both impossible and inevitable. She had spent her entire life being told she was too much, too tall, too strong, too independent for any decent man to want. Now she stood before a man who valued those very qualities, who saw strength where others saw deficiency. She looked at the assembled warriors, at the magnificent horses and gleaming silver, at the blanket of honor spread at her feet, but most of all, she looked at Ayana, whose dark eyes held a promise of respect and partnership she had never dared to dream possible. In those eyes she saw not just love but recognition, the acknowledgement of an equal, a partner worthy of standing beside a leader. It was everything she had ever wanted and never expected to find. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Martha had spent 32 years being told she didn't fit into the world of white settlers. Now she was being offered a place in a different world, one that valued her strengths rather than criticized her differences. The choice was clear, even if the consequences were uncertain. The morning sun broke through the clouds as Martha stepped forward onto the ceremonial blanket. The chanting grew louder, more joyful, as she faced Ayana and spoke the words that would change everything. "I accept," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "I accept your offer, your honor, and your alliance." Ayana's face broke into a smile that transformed his stern features, revealing a warmth and joy that took Martha's breath away. He reached out to take her hands in his, speaking words of gratitude and promise in his native tongue. Though she couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear in his tone and expression. This was a man who had found what he was looking for and was grateful beyond measure. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Warriors who had been enemies of the settlement hours before now celebrated the union that would bring peace to the valley. The chanting grew more complex and beautiful, with different voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with music. Drums joined the voices, creating rhythms that spoke to something primal and joyful in the human heart. Martha's father, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, could only watch as his daughter was transformed from the town's unwanted spinster into the honored wife of an Apache chief. The bride price was formally presented with great ceremony, each gift announced and displayed for all to see. The horses were magnificent specimens, their coats gleaming in the morning sun and their bearing speaking of careful breeding and training. The silver jewelry was works of art, each piece crafted with skill that rivaled anything Martha had seen in the finest stores back east. Necklaces, bracelets, and ornaments that caught the light and threw it back in dazzling displays of craftsmanship and beauty. The furs were equally impressive, soft and rich, representing animals from across the vast Apache territory and speaking of the wealth and reach of Ayana's influence. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Martha found herself dressed in traditional Apache wedding garments that had been brought specifically for this ceremony. The dress was made of the softest doeskin, decorated with beadwork so intricate it must have taken months to complete. Her hair was braided with eagle feathers and silver ornaments, each piece carrying significance in Apache culture that she was only beginning to understand. The transformation was complete. The woman who had been rejected by her own people was now embraced by another, valued not despite her differences, but because of them. Ayana stood beside her, proud and regal, his hand warm and strong in hers as they faced their future together. The contrast between them, the tall white woman and the bronze-skinned chief, seemed to symbolize the bridge they were building between two worlds. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted entirely in Apache, with the elderly translator explaining each step to Martha as it occurred. There were rituals involving fire and water, earth and sky, each element representing different aspects of the union they were creating. Martha found herself moved by the beauty and symbolism of the ceremony, understanding that she was not just marrying a man, but joining a culture that had its own rich traditions and deep spiritual beliefs. When the ceremony concluded, the celebration began in earnest. The warriors produced instruments Martha had never seen before, creating music that was both alien and beautiful. There was dancing, with movements that told stories of hunting and war, love and loss, the eternal cycles of life that connected all people regardless of their race or culture. Martha found herself drawn into the celebration, her natural grace adapting quickly to the unfamiliar rhythms. The settlement of Willow Creek would never be the same. Word of the alliance spread quickly, carried by riders who had witnessed the unprecedented ceremony. Some settlers were horrified, viewing Martha's marriage as a betrayal of her own people. Others saw it as a stroke of genius, a diplomatic solution to years of conflict that had cost lives and property on both sides. The immediate effect was a cessation of hostilities in the region. Apache raids stopped completely, and trade began to develop between the settlement and the tribe. Martha became a bridge between two worlds, her unique position allowing her to facilitate understanding and cooperation where there had been only mistrust and violence before. Martha Thompson, now Martha Ayana, became a bridge between two worlds, her strength and courage serving a purpose greater than she had ever imagined. The woman who had saved a drowning warrior had, in turn, been saved from a life of loneliness and rejection, finding love and honor in the most unexpected place. Her story became legend, told around campfires and in trading posts across the territory. In the years that followed, Martha would become a legend in her own right, the white woman who married an Apache chief and brought peace to the frontier. Her children would grow up bilingual and bicultural, carrying the best of both worlds in their hearts and serving as living symbols of the possibility for understanding between different peoples. They would be raised to value strength and courage, regardless of gender, and to see diversity as a source of strength rather than division. The ranch that had been Martha's prison became a meeting place for the two cultures. Apache and white children played together in the yard where Martha had once stood alone. Trade goods flowed in both directions, bringing prosperity to both communities. The river that had nearly claimed Ayana's life became a symbol of renewal and possibility, its banks hosting celebrations that brought the two peoples together in friendship. And sometimes, when the river ran high and wild, Martha would remember that fateful day when she plunged into the churning waters, never knowing that she was diving not just into the river, but into a destiny that would transform her from an outcast into a queen. The medallion Ayana had given her still hung around her neck, now joined by other symbols of her adopted culture, each one representing another step in her journey from rejection to acceptance, from loneliness to love. The drums continued to echo across the valley as the wedding party prepared to depart for Ayana's village, where Martha would begin her new life as the honored wife of a chief. She looked back once at the cabin where she had spent so many lonely years, then turned her face toward the mountains where her future lay. The woman who had been too much for one world had found another where she was exactly enough, where her strength was celebrated rather than scorned, where love had found her in the most unexpected way. As they rode into the distance, the morning mist parted before them like a curtain, revealing a landscape of infinite possibility. Martha had learned that sometimes salvation comes not from being rescued, but from having the courage to rescue others, and that the greatest transformations often begin with a single act of selfless bravery. The river that had nearly claimed a life had instead given birth to a love story that would be told for generations, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the unexpected ways that destiny can unfold. The legend of Martha and Ayanna would inspire others to look beyond the boundaries of race and culture, to see the common humanity that connects all people. Their love story became a symbol of hope in a time of conflict, proof that understanding and acceptance were possible even between the most unlikely partners. And in the years to come, when tensions rose between settlers and natives, people would remember the big woman who saved a warrior from drowning, and how that single act of courage changed the world for everyone.